problems, worries, sadness? Are you seeking solutions?
Bible says,
Do not anxious about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Choose faith over fear.
Where is God in the midst of COVID-19? What is going to happen? Hello and welcome to Hope Spot on Shalom World. I'm your host, Robert Feduccia from Nashville, Tennessee in the United States. And Hope Spot is designed to give you hope and insight for living through this time of global pandemic. And today's topic is the global pandemic and personal freedom. And joining us from Chicago, Illinois is our first guest today, Judge Thomas Donnelly. Judge Donnelly is a 12-year veteran of the bench. He is the former president of the Catholic Lawyers Guild of Chicago. He is married to Ann Wicker and has 4 boys, and he is currently an adjunct instructor in law at the Jesuit University, Loyola of Chicago. Judge Donnelly, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And also joining us from New Zealand is Brendan Malone. And Brendan Malone is the president and founder of Lifenet New Zealand. He is a much sought after speaker on bioethics, and he also has a really robust presence on social media with over 31,000 followers on YouTube. Brendan, welcome. It's good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, I'm going to go ahead right on into the kind of the heart of the question, if I could. And I'm going to refer to 2 points from Catholic social teaching, if I could. And the first principle of Catholic social teaching, it is the dignity of the individual. And part of that dignity is recognizing that we are persons of freedom and that we have a right to self-determination. But there's also a principle in Catholic social teaching of the common good, where we, to some degree, have to be, well, not to some degree, to a large degree, we have to be in mind of what is good for the greater humanity. So the heart of the question goes to this: where does personal freedom end and then social responsibility and the common good begin? Brendan, if I could, I'd like to begin with you for that question.
Well, I think one of the great things about Catholic social teaching in this area is the sense of balance. And so there's this idea that that neither should ever get into excess. So the protection and well-being of the community should never go into such an excess that it becomes collectivism, like some form of communism. And then the rights of the individual should never also go into excess so that harm is done to the vulnerable members of the community, for example. And one of the things that I think I see as a concern in the midst of all of this is that on both sides of this, you can see those two extremes starting to play out a little bit. And I think ultimately, if I was to quote an American judge, since we've got one on the panel here as well, I think it was Oliver Wendell Holmes who said that your right to swing your fist ends at the point at which my nose begins. I think that's the quote, loosely. And I think that's a pretty good rule of thumb. However, what's required is a lot of prudential judgment, I think, especially in a time when you've got a pandemic and a great state of fear that has overcome people as well.
So to Judge Donnelly, if you were on the bench hearing a case like this, where the question of personal freedom and then the common good is, what would you be looking for in a case, and how would you be able to mark that line where those two things meet?
So the opposition between law and liberty is a false opposition. And I think that's what's important to bear in mind. We have an adage and it states that laws are the wise restraints that make us free. And Aquinas, of course, said that human law is necessary because of wickedness, because of people who desire to harm others. And so for Catholic teaching and for legal thinking, there's a great harmony in that order is very important, because without order, there can be no freedom. You can have license if you have everybody doing what they want to do, but you can't have freedom, because freedom requires mutual self-restraint. So when St. Paul says in the 13th chapter to the Romans that love is the fulfillment of the law, what he's talking about is that mutual self-restraint where we each honor the other's space, to work in the Oliver Wendell Holmes, that we each are restraining ourselves from harming others. And law is to enshrine and teach that love for your fellow person by setting up training regimens, saying that going through a stop sign or violating a quarantine are an infringement on another's welfare, and the law doesn't grant you liberty to harm others. And so I'd say you look as to a law, of course, it must be a just law, as Aquinas tells us that just laws are the ones that bind the conscience, right? But we give law a very great latitude in regulating our behavior, and we don't arrogate to ourselves the ability just willy-nilly to disregard laws because we believe they're unjust. There has to be, as you said, a very well-formed conscience when you're going to engage in any civil disobedience, where you would where you would violate the law because your conscience bids you to do that. But those are extreme situations. So ordinarily, law must be enforced, and that is the bedrock of our Augustinian tradition from the City of God. It certainly is present in Paul and the first letter of Peter, that legal institutions must be complied with, laws given respect.
So, Judge, I'm going to stay with you for a moment. Brendan, this question will come to you as well. But I want to bring up another principle of social teaching, and that is that of subsidiarity, where the person has a right to participate in the decisions about the trajectory of their lives. I fully understand about what the case is with common good. And that is, there are many vulnerable people in our society. We don't know what this virus is going to do, how it can affect somebody. And it seems like every day that there are new symptoms arising that we didn't even know about. So there are those who are vulnerable. Yet, there are many decisions that have been taken away, particularly for those in their right to earn a living. I've given the example of those who work, for example, in the entertainment industry, that there is no gathering more than 10 people. There are many people here in where I live in Nashville, Tennessee, whose livelihood has been taken away, and they had no ability to participate in that decision. So again, is that something that needs to be put aside? Or do people have a real point in wanting to protest about having their livelihood taken away? And so, Judge, to you first.
Well, I think there are two questions. First of all, subsidiarity is not individualism. We in the Catholic Church are not individualists, and we're not libertarians. Subsidiarity is the principle where a decision is made closest to the level of who it affects. But Catholicism is more communitarian than individualistic. The family is probably the lowest unit, and decisions can be made on a family level or a local level. So that's the first point I'd like to make. The other there is without any role in the decision making. Of course, we elect in our Western democracies governments that govern by the consent of the government. So it's not as if we don't have any role. We get the governments we deserve, right? We elect people, and if we don't like them, we vote them out of office. So we may have disagreements with those decisions, but it's not like we can disavow any responsibility for those decisions. We elected those people who are making that decision. And I think it's not quite accurate to say that we didn't have any role in that decision. It may be at a remove because we elected them maybe a year ago or 2 years ago, but those are our elected representatives or elected executives, and there are means to which to redress disagreements we have with them, petitioning the government, protesting. And those are all things that are encouraged under our system of Western democracy because we have the right of free expression.
Mm-hmm. Well, Brendan, I know that New Zealand has been hailed as kind of a shining example of how to handle the pandemic. And so that question about the decision making, did you feel like that was something that was imposed, or was there a participation, and was there a mind towards the common good in your fair nation?
Well, it's interesting. It's actually starting to come a little bit unraveled in the last week or so, that whole, in regards to New Zealand. We have achieved a very low COVID rate of COVID in our country. One of the things is we have a very low population density, and we're an island, a small island at the bottom of the world. That has been a huge advantage. Even though our politicians are trying to claim a lot of credit for what they've done, that's a big factor for us. Also, we're just heading into cold and flu season, so our second wave is probably going to hit at some point, and that'll be telling. Now, what's happening though is, and this is, I think there's two P's that are really important when you think about this question of subsidiarity, is that you want to avoid any paternalism. And at the same time, I think that there has to be proportionality in what's happening. So about 2 or 3 days ago, our government passed a new law, which for the next 2 years will be enforced. It has to be renewed every 90 days, but there's no reason why it won't keep getting renewed because they have the majority in Parliament. And our police now have the power to enter a property without a warrant. Now that's an excess. That is an excess. Not only that, but there's current rulings on around public gatherings that are completely arbitrary. So if you have a conference, you're allowed up to 100 people present. If you own a bar, you can have 100 drinking patrons. But if you want to have any form of religious service with sober people, maximum of 10. And a lot of people are starting to say, hold on, there's a paternalism here. Now, we're being told the reason for this is because apparently there's a danger people might hug each other. But brothels are open in our country now and allowed to operate. So there's no, so see, proportionality starting to go out the window. And so this is, I think, you are starting to cross into violating subsidiarity in those areas. And where I think it's important too that we maintain focus on is our response must always be moral in this situation. I think why we're starting to see this is because possibly we've allowed panicked responses to take over from principled responses. So instead of putting principles like human dignity and the human person and their well-being first, we're starting to panic a little bit. And we look at the very frightening spectre of COVID and we start to say, well, anything goes to stay alive. And so I think some of that thinking is starting to corrupt the process a little bit of decision-making at the top. Now, our response, I think, to that must be we can respond, and I think quite strongly, but always morally, and that's important. It's not simply a matter of us sort of throwing off all shackles of restraint and acting as if we have no government and no laws in our response to that.
Well, I think you've really anticipated my next question, and perhaps you've answered this, but let me just hold it out to you, and that is we have three principles of Catholic social teaching that we're talking about: the common good, the dignity of the human person, subsidiarity. In light of all of that, have governments overstepped their bounds? It sounds like you think that there has been an overstepping of bounds, Brendan.
Well, I think in my country, certainly that has been the case. In other countries like Taiwan, I would argue they've done it very well. Taiwan have trusted their citizens and they've given social distancing mandates, public gatherings, no more than 100. They've got the best COVID rate, I think, still of any country in the world. They've never had an enforced extreme lockdown. Now, there is an argument for the lockdown. It's the precautionary principle. Because there's a lot we didn't know about the virus initially. What we thought we knew from China turned out to be completely unreliable. So what happens is in that state, you have to take the precautionary principle and say, we think that if we keep acting the way we have been, a lot of people could die. So we've got to do something. And, what happened in New Zealand was that I think we overstepped and then we didn't quite respond as more data came to the fore. We didn't adjust the policy quick enough. So for 4 weeks, I think it was over 4 weeks in my country, you were not allowed to have a funeral. You were not allowed to go to the graveside. You were not allowed to have a priest come to you if you were dying. That was a complete violation of human dignity. And we have horror stories that are now coming out. A family where the young son tragically took his own life very early on in the lockdown. And the final memory that family has is an unzipped body bag on a rainy driveway. And that was their final goodbye. Now, that to me is a law that is overstepped and is now violating human dignity. All the medical professionals I've talked to and about that have said there's no reason why you couldn't have had funerals safely with limited numbers. There's no reason why you couldn't have had a priest come to the dying. We can do all that safely. So I think in some cases, yes. And then in other cases, they should be applauded because I think they have acted well. But I think it hasn't been applied consistently wherever you go.
Well, Brendan, I really appreciate what you're offering because you're kind of moving between marrow and bone and finding the right dividing line between everything. And Judge Donnelly, I want to go to you with this, just my fellow American. Our bishops here in the United States, they have done, I think, an exceptional job in trying to describe what faithful citizenship looks like. And so how can we be faithful citizens right now? And something that I often say is the difficulty of voting in the United States. I say faithful citizenship is not limited to the second Tuesday of November. It's being active and remaining active in the entire process of public life. So from your understanding and from your opinion, how can we be faithful citizens right now during this time?
Well, I think, one of the things that Brendan brings up, laws that have been struck down here in the States, where religion has been treated disparately from other activities, judges have struck those laws down. So we would never have the situation where you could have a gathering in a bar of 100, but forbidding gatherings of the same number in a religious institution because it would run afoul of the First Amendment, and those have been struck down. But I think becoming educated about the laws, and I think advocating, I think that one of the things I try to do as a judge is take part as a judge in the legislative process, talk to legislators about issues where reform is needed, become a participant. And I think all citizens have the duty to do this because we believe that shaping the common good, which is our life together, we don't believe in a utilitarian common good, the greatest good for the greatest number. We believe we have a life together as a nation, as a city, as a state. And we shape that life through our laws because laws inform culture. They shape culture. So it's important as your duty as a Catholic to participate in the legislative process, become informed about laws, and help shape laws that will bring a more abundant life to the community in all ways. And not just look out for yourself, but look out for others in how you are advocating for laws. How is this affecting older people? How is it affecting other people in the community? I mean, Sweden is the example where there was maximal liberty, but it had a very deleterious effect on the elderly population. Well, if it's just every man for himself, then that's okay. But that would be antithetical to our Catholic perspective, where we're looking out for the whole of the community when we want to shape laws and procedures. And so an effect that has hugely disproportionate impact upon the elderly is something, even if I'm not going to be harmed, I should be concerned about, because we believe in the mystical body of Christ, that we're all tied together, and that if one member is hurt, the others suffer, right? And so we can't advocate for laws just because they help us. That's not a basis for how we want to live in community with each other.
All right, Brendan, you have two Americans, and hopefully we're not just being so Amerocentric with all of this. But as you hear what we're talking about in faithful citizenship, how would you apply that to New Zealand or other parts of the globe that you know of, similar democracies like the ones that we enjoy? Do you agree, or would you offer a different perspective for us?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think even taking into account the differences, we're under the Westminster parliamentary system. We still have a Bill of Rights, though, different from a constitution. But, even taking into account all those things, I think that what the judge has already said here is quite important. The fact that our focus as Catholics is communal. It's so essential, and that's the one thing that's been lost. 3 books that I've read in the last 2 years that I found so helpful in sort of shaping, or actually no, more than the last 3 years, but Samuel Gregg's book on Ordered Liberty was excellent. Patrick J. Denon's Why Liberalism Failed, and also Yuval Levine's book, The Fractured Republic, which does look just at America, but the principles are true. And the questions they raise about, and I see this in my country, we've become far too libertarian, you might say. So as Catholics, we should never lose sight of the fact that the first and most important community is the family. And then I would suggest the local community, what Edmund Burke might call these little oases that exist within a society that give rise to the social contract. And so I think that, and this is something we did straight away in our little cul-de-sac where we live, as soon as it was announced there was going to be a lockdown in 48 hours, we made sure that we had contacted every neighbour and that we all had each other's phone numbers and that we all knew who to call if something was going to happen, because some people are elderly on our street. So this is faithful citizenship, I would argue. And then also there's that proactive engagement and speaking up when issues, perhaps like we're currently seeing in New Zealand, certain laws, when they do go astray, there does need to be a reasoned voice of charity and civility, I think. And I think that one of the challenges we face at the moment is there is a real tribalism, particularly with social media. It doesn't promote a lot of dialogue. So we've got to find a way to cut through that and say, how do we offer not just the truth, but show people how to argue in a charitable and humane way to present our point as well.
Well, thank you for those perspectives, and particularly for pointing us to this great treasury that we have in Catholic social teaching, where we are members of the body of Christ, and we have to keep in mind those who are most vulnerable and the greater good, the common good, not just the greatest good for the most people, but for those who are the most vulnerable, that we are one body and that we are at the service of humanity. Again, thank you all for your perspectives. And thank you to our viewers for joining us here at HopeSpot on Shalom World. Whatever platform that you are joining us on, there is a way that you can let us know how we can pray for you, especially during this time. And we want to do that. Please be in communication with us so that we can. This is Robert Feduccia signing off from HopeSpot on Shalom World. We'll be with you next time right here.
To all of the viewers of Shalom TV throughout the world, I want to encourage you not only to support this amazing media apostolate, but to spread the word to others. We all know how the internet and mass media are polluting the world with the poison of pornography and so much other forms of materialism. This is the source of eternal life, the gospel, and Shalom TV is consecrated to spreading the word of Christ. Thank you.